The year is 1453, inside the convent of St. Theodosia in Constantinople. 47 nuns kneel in prayer as cannon fire shakes the ancient walls. They've been praying for 72 hours straight. Outside, the greatest siege in medieval history reaches its climax. But these women aren't just praying for salvation, they're preparing for something far worse than death. What happened to them in the next 3 days would be recorded by multiple eyewitnesses, yet their story, and the stories of thousands of Christian nuns across 6 centuries of Ottoman rule, remains one of history's most misunderstood chapters. Not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because the truth is far more complex than anyone wants to admit. See, when empires collide with faith, when conquest meets conviction, the first casualties are always the most vulnerable. And in the Ottoman Empire's 600-year relationship with Christianity, no group was more vulnerable, or more symbolic, than the women who had devoted their lives to God. But here's what makes this story different from every other tale of conquest you've heard. The Ottoman Empire didn't just conquer Christian lands, it absorbed them, it ruled them for centuries, and that means we're not talking about a single moment of violence, we're talking about a system, a structure, a 600-year relationship between Islamic rulers and Christian holy women that shifted, evolved, and yes, sometimes exploded into unimaginable horror. To understand what really happened, we need to start not with the nuns, but with the empire itself. Because the Ottoman Empire wasn't like any other Muslim power in history. By 1453, it had already conquered vast Christian territories across Anatolia and the Balkans. But unlike previous Islamic conquerors, who often forced immediate conversion, the Ottomans had developed something unique, the Millet system. Think of it like this. Instead of destroying every church and converting every Christian, the Ottomans essentially said, keep your faith, keep your churches, keep your laws, but pay us for the privilege. Christians became dhimmi, protected peoples. They paid a special tax called jizya, faced legal restrictions, couldn't build new churches without permission, and their testimony in court was worth less than a Muslim's. But, and this is crucial, they could practice their religion. Now you might wonder, where do nuns fit into this system? Christian convents fell under the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate or the Armenian Church, depending on their denomination. These religious authorities, appointed by the Sultan himself, had jurisdiction over Christian religious institutions. In theory, this meant protection. In practice, well, that depended entirely on when and where you lived. Because here's what the simplified histories don't tell you. The Ottoman Empire of 1453 was radically different from the Ottoman Empire of 1853 or 1915. What started as a confident, expanding empire that could afford to be relatively tolerant became, over centuries, a declining power desperately trying to hold itself together. And as that transformation happened, the fate of Christian religious women transformed with it. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's return to Constantinople, May 29th, 1453. The city that had stood for over 1,000 years as the centre of Christian Byzantine power is about to fall. Sultan Mehmed II, just 21 years old, has besieged the city for 53 days. His massive cannon, designed by a Hungarian engineer named Orban, has been pounding the Theodosian walls that hadn't been breached in 1,000 years. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI leads barely 7,000 defenders against an Ottoman force of up to 100,000. The defenders know what's coming. They've heard the stories from other conquered cities. According to the customs of medieval warfare, customs followed by Christians and Muslims alike, a city that refused to surrender could be looted for 3 days. Everything and everyone inside became the property of the victors. At 1 a.m. on May 29th, the final assault begins. By dawn, Ottoman forces have breached the outer walls. Emperor Constantine XI dies fighting on the ramparts, his body never conclusively identified. And then, as the sun rises over the Bosphorus, Ottoman soldiers pour into the city. Leonard of Chios, an Italian archbishop who was actually there, trapped in the city during the siege, wrote his account just months later. His words, preserved in Latin, are difficult to read even today. The enraged Turkish soldiers gave no quarter. When they had massacred, and there was no longer any resistance, they were intent on pillage and roamed through the town stealing, disrobing, pillaging, killing, raping, taking captive men, women, children, monks, priests, people of all sorts and conditions. But it's what he writes next that brings us to our specific focus. The nuns left behind, even those who were obviously such, were disgraced with foul debaucheries. Meanwhile, at the convent of St. Theodosia, remember those 47 nuns we mentioned? According to multiple Byzantine sources, they had barricaded themselves in their chapel. When Ottoman soldiers broke through, the nuns were still at prayer. What happened next varies depending on which account you read. Some say they were killed immediately, others suggest a fate worse than death. The Venetian physician Niccolo Barbaro, who kept a detailed diary of the siege, noted that throughout the city, the Turks made a great slaughter of Christians. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn, one that shows just how complex Ottoman-Christian relations would become. 3 days after the conquest, Sultan Mehmed II officially entered the city, and what he did next surprised everyone. He immediately issued orders to stop the looting. He went to the Hagia Sophia, yes, but he also summoned the surviving Greek Orthodox clergy. Within weeks, he had appointed a new patriarch, Gennadius Scalarius, and granted him a firman, an imperial decree, guaranteeing the Orthodox Church's right to exist under Ottoman rule. The Sultan even encouraged Christians who had fled to return. He needed them. Constantinople, soon to be Istanbul, needed to be rebuilt, repopulated, revitalized. A dead city was worthless to him. But what about the convents? What about the nuns who survived? This is where we encounter one of history's cruel ironies. The very same sultan who had overseen the 3-day sack that saw nuns violated and killed was now guaranteeing the Orthodox Church's right to maintain convents. New nuns would take vows. New convents would operate, though under very different circumstances than before. You see, under the new Ottoman system, Christian religious institutions faced a constant squeeze. They couldn't ring bells. That was forbidden as it might disturb Muslim prayer. They couldn't expand their buildings without special permission, which was rarely granted. They had to pay heavy taxes, and perhaps most significantly, they existed at the Sultan's pleasure. What he granted, he could take away. For the next 2 centuries, from roughly 1453 to 1650, we enter what historians call the classical period of Ottoman rule. And for Christian nuns, this period was marked by a strange sort of stability. The Millet system functioned like a series of parallel societies. Muslims lived under Islamic law. Christians lived under their own religious law for personal matters, marriage, divorce, inheritance, but under Ottoman law for everything else. Jews had their own millet. Even different Christian denominations, Greek Orthodox, Armenian, Catholic, had separate millets. For convents, this meant they were technically under the protection of their patriarch, who was himself under the protection and control of the Sultan. It was protection, but protection with a price. Let me give you a specific example that shows how this worked in practice. In 1540, the convent of Our Lady of Tinos, on the Greek island of Tinos, faced a crisis. Local Ottoman officials were demanding extra taxes beyond what the law required, a practice called bid'ah. The abbess, whose name history records simply as Martha, couldn't pay. The local officials threatened to convert the convent into a mosque. But here's where the system actually worked as intended. Abbess Martha travelled to Constantinople, a dangerous journey for a Christian nun, and appealed directly to the Patriarch. The Patriarch, in turn, appealed to the Grand Vizier, and surprisingly, the Grand Vizier ruled in the convent's favour. The local officials were reprimanded, the excessive taxes were returned, and the convent continued to operate. This story, documented in Ottoman tax records that survive in the Turkish archives, shows us something important. The system, when it worked, actually did protect Christian religious institutions. But, and this is a massive but, it only worked when the empire was strong, confident, and stable. Because here's what those Ottoman tax records also show us. For every convent like Tinos that successfully appealed for justice, there were others that simply disappeared from the records. One year they're paying taxes, the next year nothing. What happened to them? Were they abandoned as Christian populations declined? Were they seized by local officials? Were their nuns forced to flee? Or worse? The records don't tell us, they just show absence where once there was presence. And this pattern, protection in theory, vulnerability in practice, would define the experience of Christian nuns under Ottoman rule for centuries. When the empire was strong, the protection was real. When the empire was weak, or when local officials were corrupt, or when wars broke out, that protection could evaporate instantly. Which brings us to a period when that protection didn't just evaporate, it turned into something far darker. By the late 1600s, the Ottoman Empire was no longer the confident, expanding power it had been. The failed siege of Vienna in 1683 marked the beginning of a long, slow decline. And as the empire weakened, its relationship with its Christian subjects began to change in fundamental ways. The first sign of trouble came in the form of the Janissaries. Originally, the Janissaries were elite soldiers, taken as children from Christian families through the Devshirme system, converted to Islam, and trained as the Sultan's personal guard. But by the late 1600s, they had become a power unto themselves, corrupt, violent, and increasingly hostile to Christians. In 1703, in what became known as the Edirne event, a group of Janissaries attacked the convent of St. Catherine near Edirne. The surviving records found in the Patriarchate's archives in Istanbul describe how 23 nuns were violated and dispersed. The Patriarch protested to the Sultan. The Sultan issued a stern decree condemning the attack, and nothing happened to the perpetrators. This became the new pattern: attack, protest, decree, no consequences. But why were convents specifically targeted? Think about what a convent represented in this context. These were communities of women living without male protection, often with some wealth from donations and land holdings, and they were symbols of Christianity's continued presence in Islamic lands. In times of tension, they were obvious targets. The 1700s saw this pattern repeat across the empire. The convent of the Transfiguration in Anatolia, destroyed in 1721, its nuns scattered. The convent of St. Marina in the Peloponnese, attacked in 1730, fate of the nuns unknown, the records become a litany of loss. But then, in 1770, something happened that would change everything. The Russo-Turkish War began. Russia, presenting itself as the protector of Orthodox Christians, encouraged Greeks to revolt against Ottoman rule. The revolt failed catastrophically, and the Ottoman response was brutal. On the island of Patmos, home to several historic convents, Ottoman irregulars, not official soldiers but armed groups operating with implicit approval, descended on Christian communities. The convent of St. John, which had operated continuously since the 11th century, was ransacked. According to a letter from a surviving nun named Theodosia to the Patriarch, they came at dawn. We had bolted the doors, but they broke through with axes. What they did to Sister Catherine before she died, I cannot write. What they did to the younger sisters who survived, they will never speak of. This letter, preserved in the Patriarchate's archives, is one of the few first-person accounts we have from a nun who survived such an attack. Most survivors never spoke of what happened to them. In a culture where virginity was essential to a nun's spiritual status, rape was not just a physical violation, it was a spiritual destruction. By 1821, the Ottoman Empire faced its greatest internal challenge yet, the Greek War of Independence. And this is where our story takes its darkest turn yet. When the Greeks revolted, Ottoman authorities faced a choice. They could treat this as a political rebellion, punishing the rebels while protecting loyal Christian subjects. Or they could treat it as a religious war with all Christians as potential enemies. They chose the second option. On Easter Sunday, April 22nd, 1821, Patriarch Gregory V was celebrating Easter liturgy in Constantinople when Ottoman soldiers entered the church. They dragged him out in his ceremonial robes and hanged him from the main gate of the Patriarchate. His body was left hanging for 3 days, then thrown into the Bosphorus. If the Patriarch himself wasn't safe, what hope did nuns in remote convents have? On the island of Chios, one of the wealthiest Greek islands, the massacre that followed became one of the most documented atrocities of the 19th century. French diplomat François Pouqueville, who compiled testimonies from survivors, recorded that at the convent of Agia Marcella, 34 nuns were killed, but not before suffering what he delicately called outrages to their persons. But it's the testimony of Sister Magdalene, one of only 3 survivors from that convent, that provides the most detailed account. Speaking to British diplomats in 1822, she described how Ottoman soldiers and Turkish irregulars surrounded the convent on April 11th. The abbess tried to negotiate, offering the convent's treasury in exchange for their lives. The soldiers took the treasury. Then they took the nuns. They separated us by age, Sister Magdalene testified. The youngest, those under 25, were taken to the ships. The older sisters were gathered in the courtyard. I survived by hiding in the cistern. I could hear everything, but see nothing. The screaming continued for hours. When I emerged 2 days later, I found 28 bodies in the courtyard. The younger sisters were gone. We never learned their fate. Actually, we do know some of their fates. Ottoman slave markets in Constantinople recorded a surge in Greek virgin slaves in the months following the Chios massacre. The prices, documented in market records, show that young women identified as nuns commanded premium prices, not despite their religious status, but because of it. The violation of Christian holy women was both a practical and symbolic act of domination. The Greek War of Independence lasted until 1829. By its end, hundreds of convents across Greek lands had been destroyed. The exact number of nuns killed, enslaved, or forced to convert to Islam will never be known. The new Greek state, when it conducted a census of religious institutions in 1833, found that of the 412 convents that had existed in Greek lands before the war, only 148 remained. The others had simply vanished. Their buildings destroyed, their communities scattered, their libraries burned, their histories erased. If you thought the story couldn't get worse, the late 19th century would prove you wrong. By the 1890s, the Ottoman Empire was often called the sick man of Europe. It had lost most of its European territories. It was deeply in debt to European powers, and Sultan Abdul Hamid II, paranoid and desperate, increasingly saw the empire's Christian minorities not as subjects to be managed, but as existential threats to be eliminated. The catalyst came in 1894. Armenian revolutionaries, seeking the same independence the Greeks had won, began organising in eastern Anatolia. The Sultan's response was to unleash what became known as the Hamidian massacres. But these weren't military operations against revolutionaries. These were systematic attacks on entire Christian communities. And once again, convents found themselves particularly vulnerable. The French diplomat Paul Cambon, reporting from the town of Erzurum in November 1895, described what he found at the Convent of the Holy Mother. The building still stands, but it is a charnel house. In the chapel we counted 43 bodies, all women, all in religious dress. The altar had been deliberately defiled. The youngest victim appeared to be no more than 14, still clutching her prayer book. The eldest, the abbess we were told, had been crucified against the iconostasis. The survivors, there were 4 who had hidden in the crypt, were in no state to provide testimony. They had not spoken since the attack 5 days prior. What made the Hamidian massacres particularly horrific was their official nature. These weren't rogue soldiers or angry mobs, though both participated. These were organised operations often beginning with the same pattern. Muslim clerics would declare jihad from the minarets. Crowds would gather, and then, with the participation or deliberate non-intervention of local authorities, the killing would begin. Johannes Lepsius, a German missionary who conducted one of the most thorough contemporary investigations, documented attacks on 17 convents during the 1894 to 1896 period. His report, published in Germany as Armenia and Europe, includes this testimony from Sister Sarah, a survivor from the convent of St. Tripsheim near Van. They came after Friday prayers. First the Kurdish irregulars, then the soldiers, then the mob. Mother Superior tried to invoke the protection laws, showing them our tax receipts, our official recognition from the Patriarchate. The commander tore the documents and said, "There is no law but the sword today. They gave us 1 hour to convert to Islam. When we refused, they began with the youngest sisters. They made us watch. Sister Anna, only 16, lasted 3 hours before she died. By nightfall, I was one of 4 still alive from 37. They left us alive to tell others what happens to those who refuse Islam. The European powers protested. They sent diplomatic notes. They threatened intervention. And Sultan Abdul Hamid II would issue reforms, make promises, and then the massacres would continue in a different province." Between 1894 and 1896, historians estimate between 100,000 and 300,000 Armenian Christians were killed. The number of nuns among them was never officially counted, but based on the number of convents destroyed, at least 43 according to Armenian Patriarchate records, it was certainly in the hundreds, possibly thousands. In 1908, a group of military officers called the Young Turks overthrew Sultan Abdul Hamid II. Initially, Christians celebrated. The Young Turks promised equality, modernisation, a constitution that would protect all Ottoman subjects regardless of religion. For a brief moment it seemed like the nightmare might end. That hope died in 1913 when the most radical faction of the Young Turks, the Committee of Union and Progress Cup, seized power in a coup. Their leaders, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha and Cemal Pasha, had a different vision for the empire's future, a vision that didn't include Christians. World War I gave them their opportunity. Using the war as cover, claiming that Christians were collaborating with Russia, they launched what historians now recognise as the first modern genocide, the Armenian Genocide of 1915 to 1916. But this wasn't the chaotic violence of previous massacres. This was systematic, bureaucratic, efficient. The Cup created the special organisation Teşkilat-ı Mahsusa, units specifically tasked with eliminating Christians. They used the telegraph system to coordinate deportations. They printed standardised forms for confiscating Christian property. They even had a bureaucratic euphemism for murder, deportation to the interior. For Christian nuns, this systematic approach meant something particularly horrific. The CUP didn't just want to kill them, they wanted to erase Armenian Christianity entirely, and that meant forcing nuns to become Muslims, to marry Muslim men, to bear Muslim children. Consul Leslie Davis, the American diplomat in Harput, reported in July 1915. At the convent of St. Catherine here in Harput, the authorities gave the nuns a choice: convert and marry Muslim men or join the deportation caravans. 38 chose deportation. I later found their bodies in a ravine 6 miles from the city. They had been stripped naked, presumably to search for hidden valuables. The specific mutilations inflicted upon them I cannot describe in an official document. But some testimonies are too important to leave vague. Aurora Mardiganian, a survivor who later wrote the memoir Ravished Armenia, described what she witnessed at a convent near Malatya. They crucified the old nuns. The young ones, those they found beautiful, they took for themselves. The Turkish officers chose first, then the Kurdish chiefs, then the soldiers. Those who survived this were sold in the markets. I saw Sister Virgine, who had taught me embroidery, sold for 40 silver pieces. She was 19 years old. The systematic nature of the genocide meant that even conversion often wasn't enough to save Christian women. Armenian-American historian Vahakan Dadrian documented cases where converted nuns were still murdered because, as one Turkish officer explained in a German diplomatic cable, their conversion was not sincere, and their children would remember they were born Christian. By the end of 1916, the Armenian Genocide had claimed between 800,000 and 1.2 million lives. The Assyrian Christian community lost over 250,000 people. And beginning in 1914, the Greek Orthodox Christians of Anatolia faced their own systematic extermination, with death tolls reaching up to 750,000 by 1923. By 1922, the Ottoman Empire was breathing its last. The Turkish War of Independence, led by Mustafa Kemal, later Ataturk, had successfully resisted the partition of Anatolia. But as Turkish forces reconquered territory, the remaining Christians faced a final wave of violence. The climax came at Smyrna, modern Izmir, in September 1922. Smyrna was a cosmopolitan city, roughly half Christian, and home to numerous religious institutions including 7 active convents. When Turkish forces entered the city on September 9th, Christian residents initially hoped for protection. The Turkish commander Nuruddin Pasha had promised safety for non-combatants. That promise lasted less than 24 hours. On September 10th, Turkish soldiers and irregulars began systematic looting of Christian quarters. By September 11th, the killing had begun. By September 13th, the Armenian quarter was in flames. The fire spread to the Greek and European quarters. The Turkish and Jewish quarters mysteriously remained untouched. George Horton, the American consul general, provided one of the most detailed accounts of what happened at the city's convents. At the convent of St. Fotini, I personally saw the results of what had occurred. 21 nuns, ranging in age from novices of 17 to the elderly abbess, who must have been 70, lay dead in the courtyard. All had been shot, but the evidence of what had been done to them before death was unmistakable. Their habits had been torn open. Some had been mutilated in ways that specifically targeted their religious vows of chastity. But perhaps the most haunting account comes from a Turkish source. Fali Rıfkı Atay, a Turkish journalist and later close associate of Ataturk, wrote in his memoir, "I saw a nun, her habit still marking her as such, throw herself from a burning building rather than face what the soldiers below intended. She fell 4 stories to her death. The soldiers laughed. The fire burned for 4 days. The number of Christians killed in Smyrna is disputed. Estimates range from 10,000 to 100,000. The convents, churches, and Christian schools were deliberately targeted and destroyed. By September 17th, when the last flames died out, centuries of Christian presence in one of Asia Minor's greatest cities had ended. In the aftermath of these horrors, what happened to the survivors? This is perhaps the least told part of the story, because it involves a different kind of tragedy, the tragedy of silence. Many nuns who survived the genocides and massacres never spoke of what they had endured. In Armenian survivor communities in France, the United States and South America, these women often lived on the margins, unable to return to religious life because of what had been done to them, unable to integrate into secular life because of what they had been. Maria Jakobsen, a Danish missionary who ran an orphanage in Lebanon for Armenian genocide survivors, recorded in her diary the case of Sister Aghavni. She arrived at our orphanage in 1923, still wearing the remnants of her religious habit. She had been a nun at the convent of the Holy Translators in Sivas. Of the 40 nuns in her convent, she was the only survivor. For 3 years, she had been passed between Turkish and Kurdish households as a slave. She never spoke of those years, but she would wake screaming in the night. She died in 1925, officially of tuberculosis, but I believe she died of a broken soul. The systematic nature of the violence against nuns created a particular form of collective trauma. These weren't random acts of violence. They were deliberate attempts to destroy the spiritual heart of Christian communities. A violated nun represented not just an individual tragedy, but a communal catastrophe, a breaking of the sacred that could never be fully healed. Some survivors did testify, particularly during the post-war trials in Constantinople, in 1919 to 1920. Sister Hypsime Darbinian, who survived the deportations from Erzurum, testified, "They knew who we were. Our habits made us visible. That was the point. They wanted everyone to see that even God could not protect us." When they did what they did to Mother Superior in the town square, making all the Christians watch, the message was clear: your faith is powerless against our will. But most survivors remained silent. In a 1955 oral history project conducted by Armenian American scholars, they found that of the 500 genocide survivors interviewed, fewer than a dozen were willing to discuss sexual violence, and none would allow their names to be used. The shame, even 40 years later, was too great. The final chapter of this story isn't one of violence but of erasure. The Treaty of Lausanne, signed in 1923, included a population exchange between Greece and Turkey. Over 1 million Greek Orthodox Christians were forced to leave Anatolia, their home for over 2 millennia. Among them were the last remaining nuns from the few convents that had somehow survived. The convent of Panagia Soumela, perched high in the mountains above Trabzon, had operated continuously since 386 AD. It had survived Seljuk invasions, the conquest of Trabzon, centuries of Ottoman rule and even the genocides, but it couldn't survive Lausanne. In August 1923, the last 17 nuns descended the mountain path for the final time. They carried with them what sacred objects they could hide. The ancient icon of the Virgin Mary, said to have been painted by St. Luke himself, was buried in a secret location, only retrieved and smuggled out years later. Sister Macrina, one of those last nuns, later wrote from Greece, "We left behind more than buildings. We left behind 15 centuries of prayers soaked into those stones." Every morning since the 4th century, nuns had sung the dawn hymns in that chapel. That chain, unbroken for over 1,000 years, we were forced to break. That, more than anything else they did to us, felt like defeat. The population exchange was presented as a humanitarian solution, a way to prevent future massacres by creating homogeneous nation-states. But for the Christian communities of Anatolia, it was the final erasure. The Turkish Republic that emerged would be 99% Muslim. The Christians who had been there since the time of St. Paul were gone. But here's something the official histories often miss. Not everyone left. Not everyone died. Throughout Anatolia, there remained what Turks call hidden Armenians, Christians who had survived by converting to Islam, at least publicly. Among them were former nuns who had been forcibly married to Muslim men. These women lived double lives. In public, they were Muslim wives and mothers. In private, some maintained their Christian faith, teaching their children Armenian prayers in whispers, keeping hidden icons, secretly baptizing their babies with saved holy water. Fethiye Çetin's groundbreaking book, My Grandmother, revealed this hidden history when she discovered that her own Turkish Muslim grandmother was actually an Armenian Christian survivor. Her grandmother Seher had been Heranush Gadarian, taken from a death march at age 9. But Çetin's research revealed something more. Her grandmother had been educated in a convent school, and likely would have become a nun herself had the genocide not intervened. In the 2000s, as Turkey began to slightly open discussion of the genocide, more of these hidden stories emerged. In 2014, a woman in Diyarbakir revealed that her grandmother had been Sister Mariam from the convent of St. Sarkis. Forced to marry a Turkish officer at age 15, she had lived as Fatima for 70 years, but had secretly maintained her vows, never consummating the marriage after bearing one child, praying the Christian offices in silence every day until her death in 1987. How many such women were there? We'll never know. The silence was too complete, the fear too deep, the shame too overwhelming. Today, in what was once the heartland of Eastern Christianity, only a handful of functioning convents remain in Turkey. The convent of the Virgin Mary in Mardin still has 4 nuns. The monastery of Mor Gabriel, dating to 397 AD, maintains a small community. In Istanbul, a few Greek Orthodox convents continue, shadows of their former selves. But the physical absence of convents across Anatolia speaks louder than any historical account. In the city of Ani, once known as the City of 1001 Churches, the ruins stand empty. The convent of Kusanats, which housed a famous scriptorum where nuns illuminated manuscripts, is now roofless, its frescoes fading. Shepherd boys use the chapel as a shelter for their flocks. The Turkish state's relationship with this history remains complicated. The Armenian Genocide is still officially denied, referred to as the events of 1915, or blamed on mutual violence. School textbooks don't mention the convents that once dotted Anatolia or the nuns who lived in them. The systematic sexual violence against Christian women is completely absent from official histories. Yet paradoxically, the Turkish government has recently begun restoring some Christian sites, not as living religious spaces but as tourist attractions. The convent of Akdamar, on an island in Lake Van, was restored in 2007, but it's a museum, not a convent. No nuns will ever again sing the morning prayers there. The restoration preserves the building while erasing its purpose, a perfect metaphor for how modern Turkey deals with its Christian past. So what really happened to Christian nuns under Ottoman rule? The answer changes dramatically depending on when and where we look. For much of Ottoman history, roughly from 1453 to 1850, convents operated under the Millet system with relative stability. Yes, they faced discrimination, heavy taxation, and occasional local violence. But the system generally functioned. Convents survived, even occasionally thrived. The greatest threats were economic pressure and gradual demographic decline, not systematic violence. But from the 1850s onward, and especially from 1894 to 1923, Christian nuns faced increasingly systematic violence that culminated in genocide. During this period, hundreds of convents were destroyed, thousands of nuns were killed, enslaved, or forced to convert. The violence wasn't random or accidental. It was deliberate, often state-sanctioned, and specifically targeted religious women as symbols of Christian presence. The documented evidence from diplomatic archives, survivor testimonies, Ottoman records, and contemporary accounts proves beyond doubt that massive atrocities occurred. The Hamidian massacres, the Armenian Genocide, the Greek and Assyrian genocides, these happened. They're not myths or exaggerations. The systematic use of sexual violence as a weapon of genocide is extensively documented. What the evidence doesn't support is the idea that such systematic violence was constant throughout Ottoman history, or that there was some empire-wide policy specifically targeting nuns for 600 years. The reality is more complex. Long periods of difficult but sustainable coexistence, punctuated by explosions of extreme violence, culminating in genocide. Perhaps the last word should go to Sister Sepuhi Mushian, one of the last survivors of the genocide era, who died in 1998 at age 102. In a 1995 interview, she said, "People always want to know what they did to us. They want the details, the horrors, as if knowing the specifics of our suffering could somehow explain it or contain it. But what they did to our bodies was only part of it. They tried to destroy our souls. They wanted us to abandon God, to prove that our faith meant nothing. Some of us broke. How could we not? But some of us held on. Not because we were stronger or better, but because faith isn't about strength. It's about endurance. We endured. And by enduring, by surviving, by remembering, we won something back from them. Not victory, there's no victory in such loss, but continuity. The prayers they tried to silence, we still pray. The God they said had abandoned us, we still serve. That is our answer to what they did. We're still here, changed, broken in places, but still here. The story of what happened to Christian nuns under Ottoman rule isn't just about the past. It's about how empires treat their minorities, how religious violence escalates, how genocide happens not all at once but in stages. Discrimination becomes oppression, oppression becomes violence, violence becomes extermination. It's about the specific vulnerability of religious women in conflicts where rape becomes a weapon and forced conversion a tool of conquest. It's about how quickly protected status can become targeted status when empires decline and nationalism rises. But it's also about survival, resilience, and the preservation of memory against official denial. Every testimony preserved, every hidden Armenian who reclaims their identity, every restored church that remembers its nuns, these are acts of resistance against erasure. The convents are mostly gone. The nuns who once filled them with prayer are silent, but their story, complex, tragic and true, remains. Not as anti-Muslim propaganda or simplified narrative, but as historical truth. Communities that existed for over 1,000 years were systematically destroyed in less than 30. What the Ottomans did to Christian nuns was, in many ways, worse than we imagine. Not because the reality matches sensationalized myths, but because the documented truth of systematic genocide is horror enough. The empty convents across Anatolia, the silence where once there was song, the absence where once there was presence, this is the real tragedy. History demands we remember accurately, neither minimizing the horror nor inventing false narratives. The true story of Christian nuns under Ottoman rule needs no embellishment. The facts themselves carry the weight of tragedy, the echo of prayers forever silenced, and the memory of women whose faith was tested by the worst humanity could devise. Their story ends not with consolation, but with truth. And sometimes truth is all we have left to honour the dead.